where could it be? I know I put the best controller of all time down here somewhere. No, that's not it. No, that's certainly not it. There it is! The U-Draw tablet for the PS3. Best controller of all time. Mwah! Perfection. Hey, wait, what's that? Oh, the Steam controller. You know, I forgot this thing existed. I guess we could talk about it. Hello Internet, it is me, the E-Man, and today we're going to talk about the Steam controller. So the Steam controller was first released in November of 2015, and I received mine a couple months later as a gift for the holidays that season. I remember when they first came out, I thought they were super cool and I really wanted one. Since then, I use it often enough that I keep it on my desk, but it certainly hasn't replaced my mouse and my keyboard, and hell, half the time it hasn't even replaced a wired Xbox 360 controller. So that begs the questions, is the Steam controller a good controller, and is it worth that almost $70 Canadian price tag? Well, let's take a look at it and find out. The Steam controller comes in some pretty nice looking packaging. Inside the box is the Steam controller itself, along with its wireless receiver. The Steam controller does not have Bluetooth capabilities like an Xbox One S controller, and does require a USB dongle in order to operate. The Steam controller is run off of 2 AA batteries like an Xbox 360 or One controller, and the battery life is pretty good. I've only ever had to change them a few times. You receive a micro USB cable, and a micro USB to USB adapter. This is intended for you to plug in the receiver in order to physically move it closer to you if you're playing away from your PC, thereby extending the range of the receiver. As you can see, I've never had to use mine because I find the receiver actually has a pretty good range on its own. You'd have to be playing pretty far away in order to need this. Now, let's look at the controller itself. Now, the Steam controller comes off as a bit odd when compared directly to other controllers. As you can see, the handles curve upwards instead of downwards like they do on most other controllers, and have a very bulbous appearance to them. This looks like it would be quite uncomfortable to hold, but in reality it's not. The controller just kind of perfectly rests in your hands. Unlike with most other controllers where you have to hold them up, this leads to the feeling of wanting to grip on quite tightly, whereas with the Steam controller you just kind of let it sit in your hands. It's quite obvious that the buttons on the Steam controller are taken directly from an Xbox, down to the same letter placement and color pattern. But this makes quite a lot of sense, as when playing with a controller, most PC games will give you Xbox button prompts. The buttons themselves are very well made. The letters aren't actually painted on, but instead embedded in the plastic, which is a very nice feel. On the back of the Steam controller are 2 extra buttons built into the handles. This is a very similar design to the Xbox One Elite controller, or many of the custom controllers you can buy on the internet. I personally use these buttons quite a lot as they're perfect for first-person shooters. Speaking of first-person shooters, the trigger on the Steam controller is quite shallow. It can detect whether or not you push it in a little bit versus actually clicking the button, but it's just far too shallow for my taste. I much prefer the Xbox One controller, which is quite a bit deeper. Now, on the back of the Steam controller is a micro USB port so that you can plug in a wire, and the batteries for the controller are hidden beneath the double button piece, which is easy to remove with this little switch right here. It just pops right off. Now, my one major complaint with the Steam controller is just the layout of everything. It's just so weird. The left stick is in the left middle, and what's supposed to be the right stick is in the top right. This is the polar opposite to the stick layout of an Xbox controller. And the letter buttons are in the middle right. The only other controller I can think of that does this is the Wii U Pro controller. And let's face it, you don't want to be taking controller advice from the Wii U. Now, as weird as this is going to sound, one of the closest comparisons I can think of for the Steam controller is actually that of the N64. You have one central analog stick for your physical movement, and then you're expected to look around using your right hand. Of course, the N64's C buttons are quite archaic in comparison to the haptic feedback trackpad of the Steam controller, but it's the same basic principle. And you know what? I personally have great difficulty going back and playing games with the N64 controller, especially having grown up with the PS2 and its dual analog sticks. Third-person games like Zelda give me quite a lot of difficulty. Now imagine trying to play Call of Duty with an N64 controller. You wouldn't want to do it. Now it might not be as hard as that playing Call of Duty with the Steam controller, but you run into the same basic problems. Actually, looking at the Steam controller, it quite closely resembles the new Brawler controller that's recently been released for the N64. Pressing the Light Up Steam button, the Steam controller's version of the Xbox Home button, once will open up Steam. Pressing it again while Steam is open, pressing it a second time while Steam is open will open Steam Big Picture mode. This controller was designed to work in big picture mode. Okay, Kat, within big picture mode is where you will find most of the Steam controller's configuration menus. This controller is extremely customizable. You can have different button layouts for individual games, very similar to the functions of the Xbox One Elite controller. Now, remember when I said that the Steam controller required that little USB dongle in order to work? Well, doesn't this little thing look super easy to misplace if it's not plugged into your computer? And what if you want to take your Steam controller somewhere, like a friend's house? They do advertise this as being good for couch co-op after all. There's no easy way to put this thing in the Steam controller. Well, there is. It's an alternate back for the Steam controller. It comes in its own cute little box, but this cute little box does not excuse the fact that this extra accessory is an extra $13 Canadian. Now, my big question is, why is this not the default device? Look, they're exactly the same, it's upside down, except that this has a little hole where you can perfectly plug in the little dongle. It actually stays in, okay, it popped out there, but it actually does stay in pretty well. Okay, now, see, when I say that it stays in pretty well is when it doesn't work, because I swear to God, the controller's trying to make me look crazy. Just plug that in, there you go, and there, it's fine. Easy to transit. You don't have to put it in the box, you can just shove this in a bag, and there you go. But seriously, $13 Canadian for this. Now, if this wasn't egregious enough, there's also a carrying case for the Steam controller, which I do not have because it's $26 Canadian. But it's the exact same shape as the Xbox One Elite controller case. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if it's actually the same case itself, but with a slightly different middle bit. In fact, you know what? You can like sort of just kind of there. I just saved you $26, but you will have to spend like, $150 on an Xbox One Elite controller. So, there you go. Okay, so we've extensively looked at the Steam controller from a hardware perspective, and that's all fine and dandy, but let's get to the important part. How well does it play games? Now, I would like to state that for the game tests, I am not using any customization options at all. I am using the button mapping that it gives me by default when I first start up the game with the controller plugged in. That being said, let's start with an easy one. Let's go with a Valve property first. Let's start with Portal, a game that we know is playable with an Xbox controller. The Steam controller works quite well with the game, none of the button mapping seems awkward, and all the controls feel quite natural. Overall, it's very similar to the experience of playing with an Xbox controller. One thing I immediately notice, however, is that the sensitivity on the trackpad is not universal. It's much more sensitive around the edges than it is in the middle. I know this is to emulate mouse movement or even an analog stick, but I find in general it just makes looking around quite difficult, because my finger easily slips from the center of the pad onto the edges and I start spinning wildly. I find that I really have to focus on keeping my finger pressed on the center of the trackpad so that I can maintain control and not end up moving the camera much faster than I intend to. Unlike an analog stick, there's no grip on the trackpad that helps center my thumb and stop it from slipping. Also with Portal, for whatever reason, I found that I couldn't control the menus using the Steam controller. This isn't a huge deal and could probably be fixed, but it was kind of annoying. It straight up doesn't work. You cannot play Half-Life Source with the Steam controller. This makes sense given that it's a much older game and that the Steam page doesn't say that it includes controller support, but I'm kind of surprised that one of Valve's most beloved games doesn't work with their own controller, especially since the Steam controller is supposed to be a mouse and keyboard substitute, much more so than just an Xbox 360 controller clone. The Steam controller works fine with Black Mesa, functions quite similar to the way it plays with Portal. I still find aiming with the trackpad is not ideal, and I find using the D-pad to access your inventory quite difficult, although I find doing anything with the D-pad quite difficult. I think in this game I'm starting to notice that I don't like the letter button placement in the middle of the controller instead of the upper right corner. I just find it very unnatural to reach down to press a letter key. I do really like though that one of the shoulder buttons is dedicated to just instantly pulling out your crowbar.
You have autism.
I don't know, dude.
I gotta say, having never played Counter-Strike with a controller before, I found the Steam controller did quite well. Now, by no means am I saying it comes close to a mouse and keyboard, but it was actually quite good. The button mapping made sense, and the D-pad's functionality was very helpful, even if the D-pad itself is still difficult to use. In the end, the problem still comes down to the trackpad. You will never be able to duplicate the mouse's ability of snapping your crosshairs onto a target's head with anything else. End of story. And this comes from a person that plays a lot of shooters on consoles. Alright, let's try some generic Steam games now. The Steam controller works perfectly with Hitman. It plays as if it was an Xbox controller, right down to the button prompts that appear on screen. Now I play Hitman, like most of my third-person games, with a very high mouse sensitivity, because I like to be able to look around quite quickly, and even I find playing with the trackpad is a little bit too wobbly for my taste. Especially in a heated firefight, I find precision aiming is quite difficult when my finger slips onto the outside ring of the trackpad. I had no problem playing Contagion with the Steam controller, although I'm not sure why you would want to play Contagion at all. Other than that, it's the same case as Hitman, plays exactly like an Xbox controller, and the trackpad makes iron sight aiming a little bit more difficult. I found that Goat Simulator worked quite well with the Steam controller. Since the game doesn't require any kind of precise aiming, the trackpad wasn't a hindrance at all. I felt that some of the button mapping was a little bit awkward, but that's an extremely easy fix even through the Game Zone option menu. What about a game that only uses the mouse, like Papers, Please? Well, it doesn't work at all. To be fair, Papers, Please does not have controller support, but I am kind of surprised that you can't just use the trackpad on the controller instead of the mouse. What about a game that only uses one button, like the Impossible game? Well, it works. That's kind of all I have to say about it. It works. I just suck at the game. What about an old 90s DOS game that's been ported to Steam? Well, surprisingly, even though the game is being run through DOSBox, the controller works. It doesn't work well by any means, and the controls are extremely awkward, but you can still play the game. What about a game that's not on Steam, but is designed to work with an Xbox controller, like Halo? Well, it half works. I'm able to move using the analog stick, and most of the buttons seem to work, but I can't look around. The trackpad just doesn't work with the game. What about a random indie game that's not on Steam, like the Galactic Civil War? Well, like Halo, the controller half works, but oddly enough with the Galactic Civil War, there's nothing wrong with the trackpad. Instead, the analog stick doesn't do movement, so you have to play it with one hand on your keyboard and one hand on the controller, because that's not awkward at all. Alright, so now that the testing is over, where do we stand on a final verdict for the Steam controller? It might have looked like it performed kind of poorly in my testing, but to be fair to it, if a game doesn't say that it has controller or partial controller support, it's just not going to work with the Steam controller. You gotta check before you play, which I did not do. Likewise, the Steam controller is not an Xbox 360 controller. I can't just expect it to be plugged in and work as one automatically. Likewise, the Steam controller is just that, a Steam controller. I can't just expect it to work perfectly with any indie game I try it with. To be honest, the Steam controller works quite well with the games it's designed to be played with. I think in the end, the worth of the Steam controller comes down to how you want to use it. If you're someone that's interested in the fact that the trackpad is supposed to more accurately represent mouse movement than an analog stick, you might like the Steam controller. The flip side of that is you're playing a game with a trackpad, which, let's face it, no one wants to do. In the end, the Steam controller is not inherently a bad controller. It's just a very niche one. You either love it or you hate it. Or you just kind of think it's a bit useless and then you use it like a paperweight, like I do. Is it worth $70 Canadian? I don't think so. I think that price is a bit steep. I understand why it's so high. It's because it's more complicated than a lot of other controllers. But I just think that's asking a little bit too much. Especially when you have to pay another $12 for this freaking glorified USB holder. I mean, come on, Valve, what are you doing? If you need that much money to make Half-Life 3, just tell me, man. I'll give it to you!